instruments.
Mr. Ambassador, Mrs. Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to add my thanks to those of my colleagues, to everybody who's already been thanked, my colleagues and friends at the Turkish Embassy and at Istanbul Cultural University. A special thanks to Mrs. Nika Erdogin, who's come from New York for this event, and special thanks to Mrs. Delia Gottlieb, who was here when the story I'm about to tell you unfolded and was a player in that story. First of all, greetings from my colleagues at the National Museum of American History. In the early 1940s,
he was born in Istanbul in 1923, the same year the Turkish Republic was declared. His father, Mehmet Munir, was a religious Muslim who prayed 5 times a day, and yet he was aggressively anti-clerical and helped Kemal Atatürk establish the first secular republic in Turkey, thereby bringing it into the 20th century. In 1925, Mehmet was appointed as the Turkish representative to the League of Nations. In the next 20 years, he was the Turkish ambassador to Switzerland, France, England, and the United States.
Ambassador Erdogan served for 10 years here in Washington, in this building, 1935 to the very end of 1944. And because of his sons, this building has a very special history, cultural history, musical history, unlike any other of the diplomatic history of the city of Washington. When the family arrived in 1935, the boys had already encountered some jazz, American jazz in London. In 1933, they went to hear Duke Ellington, Washington's native son, at the Palladium in London, and young Ahmet was absolutely blown away by the music. He started collecting records, and when they came to the United States, the 2 boys collected so many records they had their own record room, which we'll see shortly. They arrived just at a time when swing dancing and music was taking off in the United States. This photo was taken at a ballroom in Washington. Perhaps the Erdogan brothers visited. The father was very tolerant of the boys' musical interests, and they collected eventually 15 or 20,000 recordings and started haunting.
These 2 young Turkish boys fell in love with Black American music, and when their father was appointed as the Turkish ambassador to Washington, D.C., they thought they had died and gone to heaven.
I was transported. I had never been so happy in my life because I was going to the land of cowboys and Indians, gangsters, beautiful showgirls. I'd seen 42nd Street as a movie, was a fabulous thing with these great girls dancing and everything. And, of course, the greatest thing, the land of jazz.
Duke Ellington.
Washington, I'm sent to a private school where there's no gangsters, no cowboys, no Hollywood showgirls, no jazz, no nothing, except this dreary place and these people who are much less sophisticated than we are.
By that he and his family had lived in major capitals of Europe. They did into all sorts of cultural events and were multilingual as opposed to his fellow students. Ahmet started haunting record stores, and particularly this one, the Quality Music Shop run by Max Silverman up near the Howard Theater. Later became known as Waxy Maxie's, and he and Bill Gottlieb would go there and buy records, and then the two Erdogan brothers would also go around to African American parts of the city and buy up used records from people who didn't play them anymore. They learned a lot about music and the record business from that, as well as going to hear live music, particularly at the Howard Theater. Bill Gottlieb became a fast friend. He was a reporter for the Washington Post, who became a photographer. He was also a DJ, and took many of the pictures that you're seeing in this presentation. Here the two brothers are in the record room of the residence, which was upstairs, and held a lot of recordings. They haunted the Howard Theater, where many of the great African American and even white bands of the day played. And Ahmet would go backstage afterwards and befriend the musicians, and he started inviting them over to this house for formal dinners, including Duke Ellington and members of his band, and to jam. They would have jam sessions upstairs in the boys' residence, the boys' quarters. And here are some members of the Duke Ellington Orchestra. And here are some terrific jazz musicians, including Lester Young, their third from the right, on the steps that come up to this floor that used to have the bust of Kemal Atatürk. Lawrence Brown and Johnny Hodges performing upstairs. They were two leading members of the Duke Ellington Orchestra. Teddy Wilson, one of the great pianists of the era, Teddy Singleton, the drummer. And here's a formal dinner. It's hard to imagine how special this was for African Americans to be invited into this home, treated like royalty, given a formal dinner like this, perhaps the only place in the city at that time that this could take place, because this city was very much a southern city, tremendously segregated. The stores were segregated, the schools were segregated, the federal government was segregated. When you see the book, you'll get to see this map of the Erdogan brothers, Washington. More musicians. These are at the National Press Club. After they have jam sessions here in this house for a few years, they got the idea of organizing public jam sessions and jazz concerts. First, they couldn't get anybody to let them have these because they were to be integrated bands and musicians. The Jewish Community Center let them have a concert, and then finally the National Press Club broke down and let them have a concert. And they insisted that the audience as well as the bands be integrated. You see Teddy Wilson on the piano, Joe Marsala there on the right, an integrated band. Lead Belly came to this concert, the great guitarist and blues singer. And this picture was taken by our very own Delia Gottlieb. On the left, Ahmet Erdogan, Duke Ellington, Bill Gottlieb, Mesrobian Erdogan, and
Dave Stewart.
Dave Stewart. And an unidentified friend, probably Duke Ellington's, at the Gottlieb's home. Ahmet Erdogan got so interested in the record business that he joined Waxy Maxy, Max Silverman, in starting a small record label. And by mid-1940s, he had to sell off his vast record collection. This was a nationally advertised auction. Meanwhile, Mesrobian was writing about the music in several magazines. This article came out in 1943. He was writing for the Record Changer magazine. He was briefly the editor of this magazine, which was headquartered out in Fairfax, Virginia, before it moved to New York City. And Mesrobian also bought some masters of the great Jelly Roll Morton, which were recorded here in Washington at a radio station, and persuaded a small label in Santa Monica, California, Jazz Band Records, to issue them. And Ahmet teamed up with Max Silverman and started this short-lived record company, Jubilee Records and Quality Records.
Mehmet Munir Erdogan had represented Turkey in Britain, Switzerland, France, and the United States. His passing deprives the international scene of a valued counselor.
His father died in 1944 when Ahmet was 20 years old.
That was in November 1944, and within a few months the family had moved out of this building. Mrs. Erdogan and the daughter Selma went back to Turkey, to Istanbul, And the boys faced a tough decision. Were they going to go back and join the diplomatic corps as was expected of them, or were they going to stay in the United States where the music they loved so much was everywhere? They decided to stay in the United States. And in 1947, Ahmet and his partner, Herb Abramson, borrowed $10,000 from Ahmet's dentist to start a language record company. And this is the company that gave a real start to Ray Charles and recorded so many other extraordinary American musicians, particularly black musicians. This is Ahmet Erdogan in his office at Atlantic Records. Besides jazz, blues, soul, R&B, the label issued a wide variety of music, including cabaret music, folk music recorded in the American South, all sorts of music. And in 2005, we had this exhibition about Ray Charles at the museum, and I was very honored when Mr. and Mrs. Erdogan came to see the exhibit. And then we went into the archives to share some Duke Ellington scores. We have 100,000 pages of Duke Ellington scores. And here was Mr. Erdogan, who had met Duke Ellington some 50 years earlier and knew him very well and issued some of his recordings, looking at some original handwritten scores in the master's hand. It was a thrilling day for us to host the Erdogans. Then in 2010, Ambassador Tan decided to revive the tradition of jazz in this glorious building and conceived of the Erdogan Jazz Series, featuring up-and-coming jazz musicians and as well as noted dignitaries. Representative John Connors spoke several times, the Capitol Hill's leading jazz advocate. The Warren Wolf Quartet performing here in this very room. Richard Parlato, winner of the Thelonious Monk International Jazz Competition. Jonathan Batiste and his Steady Human Band. Roy Hargrove. Cecile Salvant. And many others have performed in this room. And the last photo is a few months ago when Ambassador and Mrs. Tom were visited by Madeline Albright there in the cap, and Herbie Hancock, as well as Tom Carter, the president of the Thelonious Monk Institute. So that, in brief, is the story.